Blessings to you, beautiful soul. Welcome to Angel's message for you. Before anything else, before a single word of this message reaches you, the angels are wrapping you in a warmth that you may already be feeling right now. That gentle flutter in your chest. That quiet sense that something is about to shift. That is not your imagination. That is heaven saying hello. That is the divine reaching through whatever screen you are looking at right now and placing a hand over your heart. You are seen, you are known, and you are deeply, completely loved. Now take a breath, a real one, slow and full. Let your shoulders drop. Let your jaw unclench. Let whatever tension you have been carrying today soften just a little. Because what you are about to receive was carried here specifically for you. Not for the person beside you. Not for someone else who might find this later. For you, right now, in this exact moment of your life. Stay with me until the very end of this message. I am asking you this not to keep you here for the sake of it. I am asking because the angels have given me something to share with you in a specific order. And if you leave before the last word, you will miss the piece that ties everything together. The piece that your heart has been quietly waiting to hear. And that piece is worth everything. So stay, breathe, and let this in. Something is moving in the unseen world right now. Something real and powerful and aimed directly at your life. And it involves a love that you have been carrying in your heart. Sometimes with hope, sometimes with exhaustion, sometimes with that quiet ache that shows up in unexpected moments and reminds you that certain feelings do not just disappear no matter how much time passes. That love, that person, there is something happening on their side that you cannot see yet, but the angels can, and they have come here today to tell you about it. A decision is forming, not a small one. Not a passing thought that will dissolve by morning. A real, weighty, life-changing decision. One that has been turning slowly in the heart of someone who loves you. Turning the way a seed turns in dark soil before it finds its way to the surface. And it is almost at the surface now. The light is close. The breakthrough is close. And when it comes, it will change the shape of things between you in ways you have been quietly hoping for but maybe stopped yourself from fully believing in. I need you to understand something before we go further. The angels do not send messages to fill time. They do not interrupt your day for things that do not matter. When heaven speaks, it speaks with purpose. And the purpose of today's message is to make sure you are prepared. To make sure your heart is open. To make sure that when this thing that is coming actually arrives, you will recognize it for what it is and you will not close yourself off out of old fear or old hurt. Because what is on its way deserves to be received. And so do you. Let me tell you what the angels see when they look at the heart of the one who loves you. They see someone who has tried to move forward. Tried to convince themselves that the distance was okay, that time would make everything clearer, that feelings this complicated were better left alone. They have kept themselves busy. They have filled their hours. They have had conversations with other people and smiled when it was expected. But underneath all of it, running like a current underneath still water, there has been one constant thought. You. One constant feeling. This is not where I am supposed to be. This is not enough. Something is missing and I know exactly what it is. Your name lives in the quietest part of this person's heart. Not written there lightly, written deep, pressed in over time by every moment that mattered, every conversation that felt true, every connection that went beyond the surface into something that is genuinely rare in this world. And that depth does not go away just because circumstances got complicated or distance crept in or fear took over for a while. That kind of depth stays. It waits, keeps a place open no matter what happens on the outside. There are mornings when this person wakes up and for just a second, before the day starts pulling at them, they feel the weight of your absence. Not dramatically, not in tears or obvious grief, just a quiet recognition. Something essential is not here. And that recognition sits with them as they go through their day, showing up in small moments they probably do not even fully notice anymore because it has become so familiar. The half-second pause in a song that reminds them of something. The way a certain kind of light makes them think of a memory. The automatic reach for a phone to tell you something funny that happened, followed by the reminder that things are not like that right now. Small things, but they accumulate, and they are all saying the same thing. This person misses you in the way that only happens when someone has found their way truly into your soul. Not the casual missing of someone you enjoyed being around. The deep missing of someone who felt like home. And the angels want you to hear this clearly. All of that missing, all of that weight, all of that quiet aching has been building towards something. It has not been going nowhere. It has been going somewhere specific. It has been building toward a moment of decision. A moment when this person can no longer hold the feeling back. When the gap between what they feel on the inside and what they are doing on the outside becomes too wide to stand in. And that moment is arriving. Right now, as you receive this message, something is happening inside that heart. Not a dramatic unraveling. Something quieter and more certain than that. A settling. Clarity. The kind that comes after a long season of inner wrestling when finally, something wins. And what is winning now is love. What is winning is the desire for truth over comfort. For presence over safety. For reaching out over protecting oneself. For you. Let me tell you about the inner battle that has been happening, because understanding it will help you understand why the timing is what it is. For a long time, fear sat in the driver's seat of this person's heart when it came to you. Not fear of you specifically. Fear of what it would mean to really try. Fear of being vulnerable. Fear of being seen fully and then found lacking. Fear that too much time had passed. Fear of your reaction. Fear of the conversation going wrong. Fear of hoping again and having that hope not land where they wanted it to. These fears are human. They are understandable. And they are also the kinds of fears that can hold a person perfectly still for months, even years, while the love underneath them quietly grows larger. But here is what the angels want you to understand about fear. It does not grow stronger with time. Love does. Fear can feel enormous and immovable in the moment. But love, real love, the kind that is rooted in something genuine, has a different relationship with time. It gets bigger. It gets heavier. It gets harder to contain. And there comes a point where love is simply too large for fear to hold back anymore. The love becomes the greater force, and everything shifts. That shift is happening now. The angels can see it happening in real time. The walls that fear built are not holding the way they used to. The familiar reasons for staying silent feel hollow now. The old arguments for staying at a distance have stopped making sense. Because when you hold something true at arm's length for long enough, you eventually realize that the holding itself is costing you more than the reaching ever would. And your person has reached that realization. Maybe not in those exact words. Maybe just as a feeling in the gut. A knowing. A quiet but unshakable sense that something must change, and it must change now. You may have wondered, especially in the harder moments, whether this love was real. Whether what you felt was returned. Whether the connection that seemed so alive when things were good still existed in any real way, or whether it had faded into something only you were still holding on to. The angels want to speak directly to that wondering today. They want to say clearly and without hesitation, what you felt was not one-sided. What you experienced was not something you created alone. The connection was real, is real, has never stopped being real. And the confirmation of that is on its way to you. Not in the form of a spiritual vision or a sign in the clouds. In the form of this person actually doing something. Actually showing up in some way. Actually closing the gap between feeling and action. The form it takes may surprise you. It may come quietly. It may arrive in what looks like an ordinary moment. But when it comes, your heart will know immediately. Not because it is loud, because it is true. And truth has a particular feeling that is unmistakable when you encounter it after a long absence. The angels speak about divine timing often because people misunderstand it so easily. They think divine timing means heaven is making them wait for no reason. They think it means the universe is indifferent to their pain. But divine timing is something else entirely. It is the understanding that for something real to land correctly, both people have to be in the right place. Not the perfect place, the right place. And right means open enough, honest enough, clear enough to receive and to give in equal measure. You have been going through your own preparation, your own clearing, your own growing. Perhaps you know this. Perhaps it has not felt like growth in the moments when it was happening. Perhaps it felt more like pain or confusion or loss. But the angels see the full picture. They see what you have moved through and how it has shaped you. They see the ways you have become more yourself, more honest, more clear about what you truly want and what you will no longer accept. And they see that this version of you, the one that has lived through everything that brought you to this moment, is exactly the version that this love needs. Not who you were before, who you are now. Your person has been in their own preparation. And the timing of this decision, the fact that it is happening now and not earlier or later, is not accidental. It is the result of everything both of you needed to become before this story could continue in the way it was always meant to. The angels do not waste a single moment of anyone's journey. Every step, even the painful ones, especially the painful ones, was building towards something. And that something is this moment, this message. What is coming next? Something is about to be offered to you. Not promised in some vague future way, actually offered. And the offer will be real, not perfect, real. Because love that has been through anything always comes back with edges softened and truth sharpened. The pretense of perfection falls away. What is left is just two people and what is true between them. And that simplicity, that honesty, that willingness to show up as a real human being without a polished script, that is more precious than any grand gesture could ever be. Your person no longer wants the performance. They do not want to impress from a comfortable distance. They want to actually be in your life, in the messy, present, undeniable realness of it. They want to stop imagining what it would feel like and start living what it actually feels like. The imagination has been doing a lot of heavy lifting. And your person is done letting imagination stand in for reality. They want the real thing. They want you. Think about what it means to finally stop pretending. To stop editing yourself for protection. To stop keeping yourself just out of reach of the thing you want most because the wanting itself has become too scary. That is what is happening inside this person right now. The long pretend is ending. The careful management of feelings is breaking down. And what is underneath all of that management is clear and simple and full. It is love. It is the desire to close the distance. It is the decision to stop living halfway. The angels want to say something to you about your own heart here. Because you matter in this story just as much as the one who is coming toward you. You have been carrying things. things you have not said, feelings you have managed quietly, hopes you have kept soft so they would not hurt so much if they did not come true. The angels see all of that. They see how carefully you have been living inside this, how you have protected yourself, how you have done your best to stay open without becoming reckless with your own heart. And they want you to know that your caution makes complete sense. Everything you have done to take care of yourself through this uncertainty has been right for where you were. But they also want to say this gently and clearly. The protection you have needed up until now may become the very thing that keeps you from fully receiving what is coming. Not because you should be careless, but because what is arriving deserves to land somewhere open, in a heart that is willing to receive it, in hands that are not clenched so tightly against disappointment that there is no room left for joy. So as you move through the next days, the angels are asking you to practice just a little bit of softening. Not vulnerability without wisdom, not throwing your heart open with no discernment, just a gentle, intentional allowing, a willingness to let yourself be surprised. A small movement toward hope that is based not on naivety but on what you are learning right now from those who see the full picture. You are not being asked to forget the past. You are being asked to make a little room for the future, because it is looking for space inside you right now. Let us talk about what the angels mean when they say an action is coming. They do not mean a dramatic declaration. They do not mean everything will suddenly be different overnight. They mean something will happen that begins to close the gap. Something that shows up in your actual life in some form and says, I am still here. I have not forgotten. I want to do something about this. It might come as a message that carries a different energy than what you have received before. It might come as a reaching out that feels genuinely new. It might come in a conversation that takes a turn toward honesty when you were not expecting it. It might be quiet, but it will be real, and it will be the beginning of something moving into a new place. What the angels are saying is that your person is done waiting to feel completely ready before they act, because they have finally understood something important. You never feel completely ready for the things that matter most. You feel afraid and uncertain and exposed. And then you do it anyway because the love is bigger than the fear. Because living with the question of what if I had tried is more painful than the risk of actually trying. Your person has arrived at that understanding. They are going to try. They are going to reach. They are going to close some of the distance between where things are and where they want them to be. And when they do, here is what the angels want you to remember. You do not have to figure out everything at once. You do not have to make every decision in that first moment. You do not have to know exactly how the future will unfold. All you have to do in that moment is be present. Be honest. Let yourself feel what you actually feel without immediately managing it into something safer. Let this person see you the way you have been quietly hoping to be seen. And trust that whatever is true between you is strong enough to hold both of you if you let it. There is something the angels want to say about the prayers that have been sent up from your heart during this time. The ones you said in quiet moments when you did not even fully form them into words. The ones that were just feelings sent upward with no particular destination. They were received. Every single one of them. Heaven does not miss a single genuine reaching of the human heart. And those prayers were not for nothing. They were a part of what created this. They were part of what kept the connection alive in the unseen long enough for it to find its way back into the seen. You were not praying into emptiness. You were not hoping into a void. You were co-creating with heaven something that has been carefully held, carefully tended, and is now carefully being handed back to you. Not in the form you may have expected, not in the timing you would have chosen, but in the form and the timing that could actually work, that could actually last, that could hold the weight of something real. The angels also want to acknowledge the exhaustion, because there is a very specific kind of tired that comes from loving someone through uncertainty, from holding on without knowing whether holding on is the right thing to do, from keeping a candle burning when you are not sure anyone can see the light. That particular tired is real, and it is heavy, and it has lived in you. And the angels do not want you to push it away or pretend it was not there. They want to honor it. They want to say that the tired was part of the journey too, that the perseverance it took to keep your heart open through this is something remarkable, something that reflects a depth of love and character that is genuinely beautiful. And now the tired is being replaced by something else. A new energy that comes when something that has been in motion for a long time finally begins to move toward its destination. A sense of aliveness that comes after a long quiet. Pay attention to how you feel in the coming days. There may be moments where something shifts in you that you cannot fully explain. An unexpected lightness, a sudden sense of certainty, a feeling of things lining up. Those moments are not random. They are the first signs of what the angels have been describing. They are the energetic arrival before the physical one. The universe has a way of announcing things before they fully happen. Before the phone rings with important news, something shifts in the body. Before a meaningful person enters your life, something in the air changes. Before a season turns, the light changes color even before the temperature shifts. Pay attention to the subtle announcements happening around you. They are speaking to you. They have been speaking to you. This message is one of them. You are not alone in this. You have never been alone in this. The angels have been present through every single moment of this journey. Through the beautiful parts and the confusing parts and the parts where it felt like nothing was happening and nothing would ever change. They were there. They are here now. And they will be there when what they are describing today actually arrives in your life. You have a company of love surrounding you that is vaster than you currently have the ability to fully comprehend. And all of it is working in your favor. Heaven does not invest in things that are not meant to be. Heaven does not send messengers to speak about love stories that are finished. If this message found you today, if these words are landing somewhere true inside you, if something in your heart is quietly saying, yes, this is real, this is for me, then you already have your answer. You already know what the angels are confirming. You already know in that deep, quiet, certain way that exists beneath thought and beneath feeling. This love is not over. It is arriving. Now let me go deeper into what is happening inside your person, because the angels want you to fully understand the landscape of this heart that is moving toward you. There is a kind of emotional exhaustion that comes from loving someone in silence for too long. Every day you carry a feeling that you cannot put down and cannot put into words. Every interaction you have with the world around you is filtered through this constant awareness of what is missing. You laugh at something funny, but part of your mind is already carrying the thought of sharing it with this one person. You accomplish something that should feel good, but the celebration feels empty because the one person you most want to tell is not there to hear it. That is the weight your person has been carrying, day after day, month after month, a weight with your name on it. And that weight, instead of convincing this person to let go, has done the opposite. It has convinced them that letting go is not actually possible. You cannot put down what is a part of you. You cannot stop carrying what has grown into an essential piece of who you are. And somewhere in the middle of all those ordinary days, this person stopped trying to convince themselves otherwise. They stopped running the argument inside their mind about whether it was worth it or practical or wise. They just let themselves feel it. and feeling it fully without the commentary, without the push to manage it away, made one thing crystal clear. This love is not going anywhere, and neither is the need to do something about it. So something new began to form. Not just the feeling but the intention behind the feeling. Not just the longing but the willingness to act on it. This is a different kind of energy. This is the energy of someone who has finished their inner debate and arrived at a decision. Quiet on the outside, enormous on the inside, and it is building momentum every single day. The angels want you to notice something. When you think about this person, there is probably a quality to those thoughts that is different from how you think about others. There is a certain warmth to it, a particular texture. Maybe you find yourself thinking about them when there is no logical trigger. Maybe their name appears in your mind during moments of stillness. Maybe you have had experiences recently where something small sparked a memory or a feeling connected to them, and it hit differently than expected. The angels are saying those moments are not random. They are a form of communication that exists outside of language. That connection between you is active. It is reaching across whatever distance exists between you and making itself known. And it is doing this because it is alive, because it has not faded, because what is true does not go quiet no matter how long the silence lasts. On the other side of that invisible thread, your person feels it too. The same unexpected thoughts. The same moments where everything seems to point back to you. They have tried to explain these moments away, tried to call them habit or nostalgia or the mind playing tricks. But they keep coming, and they keep carrying the same feeling underneath them. The feeling that something is unfinished. The feeling that this story does not end here. The feeling that there is something more that wants to be lived between the two of you, and that settling for less than that is a kind of slow, quiet loss that adds up over time into a life that never fully makes sense. That feeling of things not quite making sense is something your person has been living with. Not loudly, not in crisis, just as a persistent background note. A hum that never fully goes away no matter what they do. And they have come to understand what that hum is. It is the sound of something true that has not yet been given its rightful place. It is the sound of love that has not yet been allowed to live fully in the open. And the only way to quiet that sound is to do something about it. To close the distance. To be brave enough to bring what is true inside into the actual world where it can be seen and touched and lived. This is not a small thing the angels are describing. This is a fundamental shift in the way this person is relating to their own heart. For a long time they looked at their feelings for you as something that complicated their life. Something that made clean decisions difficult. They tried to neutralize it. Tried to put it in perspective. Tried to remind themselves of all the reasons it was complicated. But at some point the effort required to keep that up became greater than the effort of simply accepting the truth. And the truth is simple. They love you. They want to be in your life. They are not okay with the way things are. And they are ready to do something different. The readiness is the miracle here. Because readiness like this does not come easily. It comes after a long journey through all the things it took to get there. All the false starts and the fear and the doubt and the almost reaching out moments that got pulled back at the last second. All of that had to happen before this readiness could exist. And now it exists. It is real. And it is pointed directly at you. The angels see the coming days with a clarity that we do not always have from where we stand inside our own lives. And what they see is movement. Real movement. The kind that starts with intention and builds toward action. Your person is not just thinking about you. They are thinking about what to do, how to begin, how to close the gap in a way that feels honest and real. They are finding their courage in small moments every day, building towards something, and that building is nearly complete. When it comes, receive it gently. Meet it with the same honesty that it is being offered with. Do not try to rush past the feelings into practicalities. Let the moment be what it is. Let the connection breathe. Let the truth of what exists between you take up space without immediately needing to be categorized or defined or decided about. Sometimes the most important thing is just to let something real exist without immediately trying to manage it. Give this moment that gift when it arrives. The angels also want you to know that what is coming is not just about what happens between you and this person. It is about what happens inside you. There is a part of you that has been waiting for confirmation, waiting to feel certain that what you believed about this love was actually true. And that confirmation is part of what is on its way. You are going to receive something that lets you exhale in a way that you have not been able to for a long time. Something that lets you lay down a weight you have been carrying without even fully realizing how heavy it was. And that moment of laying down the weight, of receiving the confirmation, of feeling the truth of this love meet you in the real world, that is its own kind of grace. You deserve to live in a love that is actual and present and not just held quietly in the heart. You deserve to have your feelings met. You deserve presence and honesty and the beautiful ordinary experience of being truly seen by someone who loves you. All of that is coming for you, not as a distant possibility, as a real and arriving thing. In the meantime, the angels want to say this: keep going. Keep being exactly who you are. The open, feeling, hopeful, real person you have been throughout all of this is the person this love is coming toward. Do not harden yourself against it in the days before it arrives. Do not talk yourself out of believing in it. Do not shrink from the feeling of anticipation that might be rising in you right now as these words settle. That anticipation is appropriate. It is your heart recognizing what is coming before it gets here. Honor that recognition. Let yourself feel it. Let the angels also speak about something that tends to go unspoken in these moments: the fear of being disappointed again. Because here is the honest truth. If you have been through the kind of waiting and uncertainty that this message is describing, then somewhere inside you there is a very protective voice that has learned to be cautious. A voice that says, yes, but what if this time is the same as last time? What if I open up and it falls apart again? What if I let myself believe and then nothing actually changes? That voice is not your enemy. That voice was born from real experience. It was built to protect you from real pain. And the angels honor that. They do not ask you to silence it, but they do want to say something to that voice. They want to say that the situation right now is genuinely different from what came before. Not because this person is suddenly perfect, not because love is suddenly simple, but because both of you have changed. And change, real change, the kind that comes from living through hard things and sitting with honest questions and growing in ways that are sometimes uncomfortable, that kind of change actually does shift what is possible. What could not work before may have been not working because something in one or both of you was not yet ready. Not ready to be that honest. Not ready to be that vulnerable. Not ready to choose love over comfort. The readiness that exists now did not exist before. And that makes this genuinely different. That is the thing the protective voice inside you needs to hear. The angels do not promise that everything will be easy from here. Love between real people never is. There will still be moments that require courage, conversations that ask for honesty, days when choosing each other takes effort. But what the angels are promising is that the foundation underneath this love is real. And a real foundation can hold the weight of all of that. Two people who are genuinely willing, genuinely honest, genuinely choosing each other, can build something that lasts. And that is what is coming together now. Not perfection, willingness. And willingness is everything. So when that protective voice speaks up in the days ahead, let it speak. Hear it. Acknowledge what it is trying to do for you. And then gently, with love for yourself, remind it that you have new information now. That things have changed. That you are allowed to walk forward with both your wisdom and your hope intact. You do not have to choose between protecting yourself and believing in love. You can do both. You can be wise and open at the same time. That is actually the most powerful place to receive something beautiful from. There is one more thing the angels want to place in your heart before this message is complete. And it is perhaps the most important thing of all. You were not wrong to believe in this. Not any of it. Not the connection you felt. Not the love you recognized. Not the hope you held on to even when holding on felt foolish. You were not foolish. You were faithful. And there is an enormous difference between those two things. Foolish would have been investing in something with no foundation. But this had a foundation. This had roots. This had something real underneath it that never stopped being real no matter what happened on the surface. Your belief in this love was not a mistake. It was not wishful thinking. It was the recognition of something true. And now that true thing is moving toward you with the kind of force that only builds over a long time of being held back. The angels want you to walk forward from this message with your head up, with your heart open, with the quiet, steady confidence of someone who has just been told by heaven itself that they were right, that they are loved, that what they have been waiting for is actually coming. Not maybe, not if conditions are perfect, actually coming, in the real days of your real life, coming for you. The angels also want to remind you of something you may have forgotten in the middle of all the waiting. You are worthy of love right now, not a future version of you that has healed more or changed more or become more. You, the one who is reading this right now, with all of the complicated feelings and all of the uncertainty and all of the beautiful, tender hope you have been carrying. You are worthy of the love that is coming. You do not have to earn it. You do not have to be ready in some special way. You do not have to have figured everything out. The love that is coming was not issued as a reward for getting things right. It is coming because it belongs to you. Because something in the design of your life pointed toward this connection. Because you matter to someone in a way that time and distance could not erase. You are enough exactly as you are in this moment. Let that land. You are loved by heaven. You are held by forces that are larger and wiser and more committed to your flourishing than any fear or doubt could ever be. The same hands that have been holding this love in the unseen are now placing it gently back into the world where it belongs, where you can actually live inside it, not just hope for it, not just remember it, actually live it. This is the gift the angels are bringing you today, not just information, not just comfort, a genuine confirmation from heaven itself that what you have believed, what you have hoped, what you have quietly prayed for in your most honest moments was not wrong, was not too much to ask for, was not a dream too large for the life you are actually living. It was the truth, and the truth is on its way home to you, to the beautiful soul who stayed all the way to the very last word of this message. The angels bow to you, not because you received these words, but because you were brave enough to keep your heart open enough to let them in. That openness is everything. That is the very thing that makes love possible. Protect it. Honor it. Let it lead you forward into the days that are coming. The coming days are going to bring you something beautiful. It may arrive quietly. It may arrive when you are not watching for it. But it will arrive. And when it does, you will feel it settle into you like something that was always supposed to be there, like something finally coming home. Heaven's blessing is upon you. Peace is on its way, and so is the love that was always yours, with infinite light and the deepest care. Amen.